Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 7 of the Higgs Flicks podcast. I am your host, John Higgins. What an incredible month this has been. I have so many things I want to share with you. First off, this month hit the ground running on July 3rd when a showing of Hamilton became available on Disney+. For the sake of transparency, before the streaming release, I had never even so much as heard of Hamilton because, frankly, I'm not wealthy nor a billionaire in New York. So seeing a Broadway show is just something that has always been out of reach for me. The only time I even get close to the experience is if they either make a film adaptation like Amadeus or Phantom of the Opera, or they record a live performance of the play, which is what you have with Hamilton. And man, am I glad I got to experience such a play. For those of you like me who have been living under a rock for the past 5 years, Hamilton chronicles a life of Alexander Hamilton, who went from being an orphan Scottish immigrant to one of the most influential figures in United States history. This play explores themes of death, legacy, and the desire to do something that will be remembered long after your death for generations. The first thing I want to praise about this play is, first and foremost, the work of Lin-Manuel Miranda and the life he brings to this character. Not only does Miranda do a phenomenal job at portraying the titular character, but he also wrote and directed this play, as well as wrote the book that the play is based on. And that level of understanding of this historical figure goes a long way when physically portraying Hamilton's attitudes and insecurities, and overall why he has so much conviction and passion in the things that he believed, wrote, and spoke about. With that being said, as far as acting itself goes, Miranda is probably the least interesting part of the play. That's not to say he's bad by any stretch, far from it, but rather the entire cast is portrayed with such raw energy that Hamilton feels like a side character in his own show. My favorite actor personally has to be Daveed Diggs as Marquis de Lafayette in the first act, who then plays Thomas Jefferson in the second. Diggs brings about a level of playfulness to the role that I wasn't expecting for a character like Jefferson. Diggs plays Jefferson with an air of cockiness and arrogance that is so boisterous and so loud, you can't help but be fascinated by this character, and especially the actor who plays him. This level of flamboyance is found throughout the play, through the most interesting, if not the best part, the music. When one pictures a play about the American Revolution, hip-hop is not the first thing that comes to mind, and yet the majority of the play is done through rap and hip-hop. The song that gets reprised the most, that is essentially this version's Remember Me, is My Shot, which, no joke, straight up sounds like Eminem's Lose Yourself. I mean, just listen. I could legit work out to this song. Speaking of Eminem, anytime there's a debate, it's done like a rap battle from 8 Mile, with hype men, MCs, and even mic drops. And using this type of music serves as much more than a stylistic choice, because despite being a more recent style of music, it perfectly fits a story about a group of young, scrappy men with nothing to lose and a lot to prove, who like to thumb their nose at the establishment and constantly pushing for social and political change. That's hip-hop right there. That's 8 Mile. That's straight out of Compton. That's hustle and flow. But hey, if you're not into hip-hop, it's cool to have a narrow music palette, because this play dips its toes into Dixieland jazz, soulful R&B, and even the typical type of music that you would hear in most plays is not only present, but every last song, no matter what the genre, is composed and sung perfectly. 2 singers in particular who I really felt put the music in music theater are Leslie Odom Jr. as Aaron Burr and Philippa Sue as Eliza Hamilton. These two belt out notes that us mortal humans can only dream of being this good. I personally like to think of myself as a pretty good singer, but then I hear vocalists of this caliber, and I'm just immediately humbled by how talented these two are. Another thing about this play is I was very surprised at how funny it is. A lot of the jokes are done through clever little puns, but there also is a great level of physical comedy at work, especially with Jonathan Groff as King George. This man is essentially a living, breathing cartoon character. There's one point during a song where you can clearly see the guy spit, and he has the most hilarious facial expression, never once breaking character. He kind of reminded me of a real-life King John from Robin Hood, but more sassy. And these little spit-take moments wouldn't have been possible to catch without its proficient use of cinematography. Yes, this is obviously a play, but it is shot like a full-on film. The camera doesn't stay in the same place the whole time. This is a production, and they treat it as such. So wherever the action goes, the camera follows. This production value is also found in the set, because in the middle of the stage there's this giant circle that spins around like a lazy Susan, which creates a really interesting special effect where A character gets shot, for instance, and they let the platform just kind of carry them into the unknown. Maybe it's because I've never seen a Broadway play live, but I don't think I've ever seen someone use the stage in such a clever way. All in all, this is an excellent play. It's well acted, well sung, the sets amplify the emotion on stage, and the cinematography are all used to capture one of the most entertaining shows out there. I only have a few complaints, and they are extremely minute. One, if you have a hard time connecting with musicals, I got bad news for you. This entire play is either sung or rapped. There is possibly a grand total of 5 minutes in total where there is any spoken dialogue. The second is this is a very long play that does not really give you much time to breathe, but that can also be considered a good thing. The third and final thing, while it is shot well, I'm sure it doesn't come close to encapsulating what the full experience must be like to watch it live. But then again, if we didn't have it available to stream, I wouldn't have gotten to experience something like this at all. Very solid play from beginning to end. I highly recommend it. And I'm gonna give Hamilton an A. Next thing I want to talk about is a video game that has been the subject of a lot of controversy for the past couple months, The Last of Us 2. This game takes place 7 years after the first game, which makes sense. The first game came out in 2013, and this one came out this year. And this one deals with the consequences from the first game. And if you don't remember, because Joel was unwilling to sacrifice Ellie, he more or less doomed all of humanity. No sin goes unpunished though, as this game basically starts out with Joel getting brutally murdered by an individual who was there that fateful night. This understandably sends Ellie over the edge as you embark with her on a John Wick-style quest for revenge. First thing I want to talk about is the story, because that does seem to be where most fans are divided on. And I have some positives and some negatives to say about the game's story. On one hand, I think this game is expertly scripted in a way that it lands on so many different emotional beats. And I'm not even necessarily talking about the big action moments, which were definitely a big part of it, but the little things, like visiting an aquarium or strumming a guitar or walking around a farm. For a game as violent as this, these little moments were always a nice breather. The negative thing I have to say about this story is it feels a bit fractured. Something happens in the middle of the game where you no longer play as Ellie, and you play as Abby, the woman who killed Joel at the beginning of the game. And at first it was like, oh, no big deal, I'm sure it's just a flashback. But nope, you play as Ellie for about the next 4 hours or so. And so you see the entire past 3 days from her perspective and the people she interacts with. And I know there are some who absolutely hate Abby, and to be frank, Abby's story does have some issues, but not for the reason so many seem to be up in arms about. The first major complaint feels similar to people having complaints about Ellie having a girlfriend, is people don't like how huge and muscular she's built. Which I get from a zombie apocalypse perspective. Resources are short, so it'd be impossible to get that big. But I also guarantee you wouldn't hear a peep if Abby was a dude. I mentioned Ellie having a girlfriend, and some saw that as an example of forced diversity, which to me seems pretty absurd. You're playing a game about the zombie apocalypse, but it's hard for you to wrap your head around the fact that one of the playable characters is super strong and the other is a lesbian. To me, these are just some complaints about the crybabies who are sad they aren't at the center of attention for a change. But there also is the obvious one, and that's Abby killed Joel. Let's be real though, Joel kinda had it coming. Like, he doomed all of humanity. What did you expect to happen? The problem with this game's story is not the way it handles representation or the fact that they killed off a character. The real problem is that they go from Ellie, who you play as for 3 whole hours, and then you switch to Abby, and you have to reset your mind to follow this new narrative and follow all the people that Abby interacts with. This makes the game overall feel disjointed and forces you to recall plot points that you forgot about hours ago. It's as though you're playing as 2 different games, and neither of them feel complete. I will say, I think the story sticks the landing in the end, but it's quite a chore getting from point A to point B. That's really all I have to say about the story. Now let's talk about the gameplay, because after all, it is a video game, and I'd be remiss not to address the most important part. On the whole, I really like it. The controls have been tweaked since the last game, which makes it a lot easier to use, and everything feels a lot more streamlined. I also really like the crafting system, as well as the new weapons at your disposal like proximity mines, which add an extra layer of strategy with the combat. And if you have a thirst for gore, the melee in this game is graphic. It doesn't matter if you're doing a stealth kill, a direct attack, or you're watching your face get bludgeoned for the 20th time because some dude with a sledgehammer won't leave you alone. I do have a couple complaints about the gameplay. One, all the supplies you grab are scattered pretty lazily. It got to a point where I realized if I just hug the wall constantly, then I'm guaranteed to get all the supplies I need. The second is, while I love the way the combat works, you don't really get much of it. And what I mean by that is actually my biggest criticism of the game. There are so many cutscenes. Having a game play out like a movie is something Naughty Dog has been notorious for ever since Uncharted, but even then, it still felt like it had a fair balance between QuickTime event, cutscene, and regular gameplay. Here, it feels like the majority of the game is cutscene. To prove my point, let me tell you guys a true story. So one day, my wife got super frustrated at the game because there was an item that was just out of her reach, and it was one that she couldn't really go back to. So she tried to load the game to a previous save file. Unfortunately, it took her about an entire hour back. So she just said forget it and decided to spend her time elsewhere. Me, being the loving husband that I am, picked up where she left off so she could get back to speed without having to backtrack too much. At first I thought this would take an hour out of my day, but after skipping all the cutscenes, I was able to get back to her in a matter of about 20 minutes. That's bad. You shouldn't have your game go so by just because I skipped all the cutscenes. That's barely a video game at that point. All in all, The Last of Us 2 is a mixed bag. It did so many things right, like the story and the little meditative moments, and the combat is nothing short of exhilarating. On the other hand, it feels like two stories are constantly fighting for your attention, and it never feels like it achieved this level of groundbreaking methods of storytelling that it was aiming for. The power-ups are way too easy to find, and the game feels like it's more cutscene than actual gameplay. If you look at some of the reviews online, it's either the greatest game ever made, or it's the worst game to ever come into existence, which neither is true. It did some things really well, but leaves other things to be desired. I feel like when something is attached to a franchise, the public reaction tends to be based on what they perceive the final product should be and not what it actually becomes. And when it doesn't match what the audience has pictured in their heads for the last 7 years, the opinions are going to be less than objective. This game is by no means a masterpiece, but it's no dumpster fire either. And I'm going to give The Last of Us 2 a C+. Along with finishing The Last of Us, I also finished something that I've been working on with my wife for the last year or so, and that is her favorite show of all time, MASH. That's right, not anything recent like Full Metal Alchemist or Mad Men or even Boy Meets World. MASH, the 1970 series that ran for 11 seasons about a staff of army doctors in the Korean War who use humor to cope with the stress of working in the middle of a war zone. Not exactly the show I would expect someone like my wife to be into, who not only can't stand most war films I show her because it stressed her out, but, much like me, was born way after the show ended. But we went through it all, and I must say, I get why she likes it so much. The strongest part is by far the ensemble cast, who work off each other so well with every episode. The show certainly has a main character, but every last one feels like they have a specific role to play in this camp, which makes the environment feel that much more lived in. You got some characters who are there to maintain order to various degrees of success. You have others who think the US military is the greatest thing man ever invented, who not only are hilariously fanatical, but also serve to contrast more comedic characters such as our everyman and main protagonist, Hawkeye Pierce. This man wants absolutely nothing to do with the war and is only there because he was drafted. While he does have a chip on his shoulder about this fact, he's probably the funniest character here. Though that's also because without the aid of humor and an endless supply of martinis, he'd probably go insane. Something I found very interesting about this show is people's reaction to it over its 11-season run. But what I can tell, looking at the IMDb scores, most of the MASH fanbase prefers the earlier seasons, while the scores get lower as the show progresses. And I'm not saying these people are stupid or anything, but I think they are misled. I personally think the show's latter seasons is when MASH really hit its stride. I think the reason the fanbase is so split is because the first half of the show is very lighthearted and very sitcom-esque. They even have a laugh track at certain episodes. Whereas the second half is much more somber and tackles much deeper and complex issues like PTSD, depression, racism, and even the existential dread of death. And it all around feels more like a war zone and not just another sitcom. That's not to say there's no humor in the latter seasons, but rather it feels more like a coping mechanism and less like an excuse to let the laugh track run. Not only do I prefer the more grounded tone of these latter seasons, but I also prefer the characters. Over the course of the show, various key characters step away from the role primarily because the actors simply got tired of playing them. This was always sad when a character either gets killed off or shipped back home, but the new characters they add not only fill the role, but leave an even bigger impact than their predecessors. For instance, the guy who plays the role as Hawkeye's best friend is this Will Ferrell-looking dude who's basically just a Hawkeye clone. And then later on, they switch to a guy who can be just as funny as Hawkeye, but has an entirely different worldview because he's a family man, which makes this contrast much more of an interesting duo. This change can also be shown in who is the man in charge of this unit, because they go from this incompetent oaf to a military man who is firm but fair. And then the kind of smarmy Squidward type character goes from this grown-up JROTC wannabe to a rich guy who is just as stuck up as the military guy, but is just as miserable as Hawkeye is. I genuinely just love how this show grows up and perfects itself in every last season. This is a show I am extremely glad I got to sit down and watch, and I'm thankful to my lovely wife for showing it to me. It's an okay show in the beginning, and then evolves into the very definition of television perfection. And I am going to give MASH an A-. So, I reviewed a Broadway musical, a PlayStation game, and a television series. But now it's time to get to the actual movies I saw this month. The first film I want to tell you about was recommended to me by my good friend Ivan Lichtenstein. And if you haven't already, subscribe to his channel. I especially recommend him if you want to hear from someone who has more independent tastes, because he can turn you on to some really fascinating hidden gems you might have never even so much as heard of before. Case in point, the film he recommended to me this month was called System Crasher. This is a German film that came out last year, directed by Nora Fingscheidt, about a 9-year-old girl named Benny who suffers from a developmental disorder that stems from a very frightening trauma that happened in her early childhood. As a consequence, anytime someone other than her mother touches her face, it triggers that horrible memory and causes her to violently lash out at anyone close by, including other children. Because she is a danger not only to herself but to others, she is known as a system crasher because no matter where the German social services take her, it always ends in the same destructive manner. The best thing about this film is by far Helena Zingel's portrayal as Benny. Playing a person with a mental disability is extremely challenging even for a grown actor. Case in point, you can either work wonders like Tom Hanks' Forrest Gump, or you can be an absolute joke like Sean Penn in I Am Sam. So for an actor as young as Helena Zingel to handle this character, not only with competence, but to actually get right the subtle mannerisms of someone with such a unique condition is frankly astounding. Zingel also displays an extremely wide range of acting by portraying Benny as sweet, if not ill-mannered at certain times, to acting like an absolute demon straight from the pit of hell, while never coming across as overacting. That level of range is incredible, not just for a child, but anyone who considers themselves an actor. Zingel has already won several German awards at this point, and I hope to see her garner more international attention before the year is over because I can't praise her acting enough. Another thing I have to say is I was blown away at how unafraid they were to do certain things. They really aren't scared to show you the uglier side of the world and just let you know exactly how things are. I read one film critic describe this movie as the opposite of a family film, which really hits the nail on the head. There are certain events that happen in the film that would never get greenlit in the US. There's one scene at an ice skating rink where a kid around the age of 4 touches Minnie's face and causes her to slam this kid's head into the ice skating rink repeatedly, showing a puddle of blood getting larger and larger with each passing hit. That's something you could never get away with showing in the US, and yet here it is, because the fact is, that's something that happens sometimes. I've seen similar stuff happen like that before, and so I have to give this movie credit for being brave enough to display such a real occurrence and never once sugarcoating that fact. My only real complaint, and you can argue with yourself whether this is a complaint, but the whole movie all around is pretty dark, so I was hoping for a more resolution at the end. Unfortunately, it never allows you to have that satisfaction. That's not to say I need a happy ending in all my movies, but rather, if you're gonna go that dark throughout the entire runtime, I feel you owe the audience a little bit of resolution, if nothing else to break up the monotony. All in all, this was a very well-made film and has some of the best acting I have seen in a long time, and I am gonna give System Crasher a B-. This next film is one that's been on my radar for the past couple years, but given its dark subject matter, I kept putting it off until the other day on July 18th, when I watched the 2016 Martin Scorsese film, Silence. If you aren't aware of this movie, don't feel too bad. This $46 million project didn't even break even, reaching a worldwide gross of only $24 million. And to be frank, I do understand why. This is a hard movie to sell. The movie is about two Jesuit priests from the 17th century, played by Andrew Garfield and Adam Driver, who traveled to Japan in search for their mentor, who has been rumored to have committed the act of apostasy, and while they're there, also attempt to attract more converts in the process. The thing I like most about Silence is it's very honest with our relationship with religion. When the film starts out, our two main leads seem to be the most devoted Christians to ever live, but the longer they stay in Japan, the more their faith gets tested, because at this time, Japan saw Christianity as more of a threat than something of hope. And so they would torture and kill people by the thousands who identified as Christians. But it didn't just stop at torturing and killing Christians. These people put our two main characters in a moral dilemma by telling them to deny their faith, or they'll kill off more Christians in the process. Which brings up a very interesting question. What is a good Christian to do in this situation if you actually believe what you believe? Do you stay true to your faith and avoid committing the act of apostasy and let other people die? Or is it more Christ-like to renounce your faith to save the lives of others? This film would argue that not only from a moral but a religious standpoint, the answer is the latter. Because that right there is technically an act of sacrifice to benefit the greater good. It is what you would call, what would Jesus do? I also appreciated the way the Japanese are portrayed in this film. It would have been so easy to give these characters the God's not dead treatment and make them a bunch of mustache-twirling villains out to get the Christians, but they aren't. That's not to say that they were right to torture people because of their religion. No, that was evil. But rather, you understand where they're coming from, because at this time, when Christianity would come into Japan, European colonization soon followed, until the two became intertwined and indistinguishable. So in a way, the church only had themselves to blame for the hostility towards Christians at the time. This film has easily some of the best writing and some of the most nuanced treatment of religion I have ever seen. More than that though, this film has some incredible cinematography. Many shots are done from the point of view of our two main leads, which puts the viewer right smack dab in the middle of the emotional turmoil. Several other shots employ a combination of long takes and wide angles during scenes in which the protagonists are forced to helplessly watch as so many Japanese get tortured and killed for their sakes. Interestingly enough, while this film tackles an extremely depressing subject matter, the landscapes are nothing short of gorgeous, as you can see in shots of mountains and oceans and even series of huts. Every last shot in this film is done so well to convey such strong emotions either about the tone of the atmosphere or the mental state of our two main characters. Whether you consider yourself religious or not, I highly recommend this film. It has realistic characters, gorgeous cinematography, beautiful landscapes, superb writing, and a nuanced take on the subject of faith that can be appreciated no matter what kind of background you have. And I am going to give Silence an A+. Alright, I talked about a really good movie. Now let's talk about a really bad movie. Or shall I say, a really bad movie. It's Batman and Robin. Where has this amazing piece of film been all my life? I haven't seen a movie make me laugh so hard at its own incompetence since The Room. Then again, though, at least The Room was made independently. Batman and Robin had the Hollywood giant of Warner Brothers by their side. That means that some Warner Brothers exec, who accepts and rejects scripts for a living, saw this movie and thought, yeah, that's acceptable. Normally, this is where I give you a brief synopsis in the film, but if I'm being perfectly honest, I'm not even sure to describe it. So here's my best attempt. Batman and Robin struggle to maintain their friendship while trying to stop Mr. Freeze and Poison Ivy from freezing the city of Gotham. That's it. So many decisions in this film make no sense, though you basically know what you're getting into right from the start. After the opening credits, you get verbatim this sequence of shots, and you can quote me on this. Bat nipple, bat nipple, ass, crotch, ass, crotch. And then this shot continues showing these little 2-second shots of Batman and Robin each grabbing their own individual weapons. And that's just the first minute of this monstrosity. Usually when you have a movie, you have a combination of good decisions and some bad ones. This, however, is just an endless series of mistakes scene for scene. The most obvious one is the acting. This is most apparent with Uma Thurman as Poison Ivy, who, mind you, is a terrific actor in most other movies. She was in 2 of my favorite Tarantino films ever made, one of which she was nominated for an Oscar for just a year before Batman and Robin. But here, you wouldn't be able to tell. Her movements and speech patterns are so unnatural that I am hyper aware that I am looking at a lady in a poorly made costume and not a supervillain. She's also supposed to be really sexy and seductive, but nothing about her screams sex appeal. She's less actually sexy and more what a gay guy assumes people would find attractive in a female, which is exactly what happened since this was directed by Joel Schumacher. To be honest, Batman and Robin were given more sex appeal than anything considering their costumes. That's another thing about this movie. The costuming is an absolute monstrosity. The most obvious one is those nipples that were introduced in Batman and Robin, and for this movie, Schumacher was just like, yeah, we'll keep doing that. And then you got the costume for Mr. Freeze, Poison Ivy, and Bane, all of which look like homemade cosplays than actual film costumes. Finally, the way these characters are portrayed and their motives make no sense. Batman has a Bat credit card. Robin turns into this obnoxious little brat because he's too busy simping for Poison Ivy, and Mr. Freeze feels the need to make ice-related puns anytime he does literally anything.
Allow me to break the ice.
You're not sending me to the cooler. What killed the dinosaurs? The Ice Age! Stay cool.
Let's kick some ice.
There is no logic to this film whatsoever in any inconceivable way, and the reason is because this movie is not a real movie. And that's not me trying to sound like Martin Scorsese. I mean, this film exists first and foremost not to tell a story, but to sell toys. And that's not even an exaggeration. They had action figures set up for the characters and the Batmobile long before the script was even finished. And so, the makers of this film actually took notes of the action figures and designed the script around these models. So, if this film ever feels like a giant Happy Meal commercial, that's because it is. This movie is an absolute dumpster fire. It's got bad acting, bad costuming, bad writing, and just all around bad everything. This movie is garbage, but I would put this in the so bad it's good category. So take that as you will. But I gotta give a grade to this, and if you haven't guessed, I'm going to give Batman and Robin an F. Now let's talk about a really good film. For the past few months of quarantine, I've been going through all the Pixar films and ranking them as I go on my Letterboxd page. I saw a few other Pixar films this month, but the one I really want to talk about is Coco, the 2017 film directed by Lee Unkrich and Adrian Molina. When I first saw this movie, I was absolutely blown away, and had it somewhere in my top 5 Pixar movies of all time. And so, upon rewatching, I was curious if I would still have that level of excitement for it as I did a couple years ago. If you've never seen this movie, the film is about an aspiring musician named Miguel, whose family despises music because of some family drama that happened about 50 some odd years ago. Convinced his great-great-grandfather was world-famous musician Ernesto de la Cruz, he steals his guitar and accidentally finds himself in the land of the dead. There, he must reunite with his great-grandfather, or else he will be stuck in the land of the dead forever. After the second go-round, the thing that I appreciate the most is the attention to detail this movie puts into portraying Mexico. When you hear about a company as massive as Pixar is making a movie about Mexico, and its lead director is a white dude, you might get a little nervous, and why wouldn't you? It certainly wouldn't be the first time Disney completely botched the portrayal of an entire people group, but they actually go over and beyond what you would expect from them. For one thing, Lee Unkrich was smart enough to understand that he was a white dude from New Jersey, so rather than just blindly plowing through and hoping for the best, he hired Adrian Molina as co-director. This film's diversity doesn't stop at its co-director, though. Nearly 100% of this cast is either Mexican or of Mexican descent, with the exception of John Ratzenberger, who has been in every Pixar film since Toy Story, and his screen time lasts a grand total of 5 seconds.
For your visit.
Gracias.
Not only is this cast almost entirely composed of Mexican actors, but most of these actors are relative unknowns with the exception of Benjamin Bratt and Gael Garcia Bernal. And also, just about every cast and crew member, down to the musicians who composed the score for this film, are predominantly Mexican. Not only did they hire the right people for this job, but it's also clear they did a hefty amount of homework to give this film a greater level of authenticity. During pre-production, they took pictures of Mexico reaching from the Texas border to the far south side bordering Guatemala, just to ensure they get the lighting, color palette, and general culture down to a T. The A to Z show's Arturo Zurita says it best.
Coco got the color of the gates in my house in Mexico right. They knew exactly which were the best conchas to take to the afterlife. Coco has characters that look like my tia Chela. They say phrases I didn't even know Pixar employees knew. And they brought out the most Mexican thing of them all. La chancla.
Pixar did a phenomenal job at portraying Mexico, but that level of representation is meaningless if the movie sucks. So, let's get into it. My favorite thing about this film is the animation. Pixar has earned a reputation for upping its animation game with every single movie that isn't Good Dinosaur, and Coco is a testament to that reputation. The best example is The Land of the Dead, which is so colorful and vibrant, going all the way from the flower petal bridge to the architecture modeled after real-life neighborhoods in Mexico that are required by law to all be different colors from one another. And if I'm going to be honest, it's jaw-dropping to look at. Next, the soundtrack is easily one of, if not my all-time favorite movie soundtracks of all time. There's not a single bad song in this. Everything from the warm and meditative song Miguel plays on his homemade guitar, to the loud and pulse-pounding La Llorona, to Remember Me, which conveys a wide range of emotions depending on which part of the movie you're on. If you're looking for a movie that's not only a joy to look at, but also to hear, look no further than Coco. Really, the weakest part of the movie is the story. For one thing, it feels a bit far-fetched that Miguel's parents would ban music across 5 different generations over something that happened nearly a century ago. And another is Pixar employs a trope that borders on cliché territory that they've used so many times. The surprise villain. If you don't believe me, here's a list of all the surprise villains we've gotten from Pixar over the last 20 years. Stinky Pete in Toy Story 2, Mr. Waternoose in Monsters Inc., Charles Muntz in Up, Lotso in Toy Story 3, and most recently, Evelyn Dever in The Incredibles 2. And if you don't want to be spoiled, here's your warning now, but Coco exhibits the same exact trope with the character of Ernesto de la Cruz, the musician that Miguel idolizes. And the thing is, if this were like the second or third time of them doing this, I wouldn't mind it so much. But because it's around the 5th time of them doing this, you practically expect Ernesto to be the bad guy at this point. Though with that being said, I think Coco utilizes this trope to its benefit by teaching an extremely valuable lesson to not put celebrities on a pedestal because they're human and capable of wrongdoing. And I also think this plot twist, while yes is overdone, helps solidify the emotional weight this movie has when dealing with universal facts like your family won't be around forever, so it's important to appreciate them while they're around, which all around comes to a head at the very end when Miguel reprises Remember Me to his grandmother Coco, which no longer is about this egotistical drive for fame and fortune like in the beginning, but instead is personal and it's just this plea to not be forgotten by the ones that you love. So yeah, after 3 years, I still really like this movie. Despite this being done by the Hollywood capitalist powerhouse that is Walt Disney Pictures, they do a good job at portraying Mexico with authenticity by who they chose to hire for this project, as well as the extensive research they did of the landscape and the people who live there. It's a feast to the eyes and ears through its colorful animation and its nearly perfect soundtrack. Certain story beats in this film are pretty overdone at this point, but it's done so well in the way it drives the emotional force in this movie that it's honestly not that big an issue. It's by no means a perfect film, but it does get so many things right. And I'm gonna give Coco a B+. The next film I don't even necessarily want to talk about, but we're going to mention it here anyways. Scoob! It's not this film does anything horrendous necessarily, it's just this entire picture is the most middle-of-the-road, lowest common denominator cash in on a franchise I have ever witnessed. And no, Batman and Robin doesn't count, because at least it was interesting, if not horrendous. I'm not even going to attempt to explain the plot to you. I'm just going to read it off IMDb. Scooby and the gang face their most challenging mystery ever. A plot to unleash the ghost dog Cerebrus upon the world. As they race to stop the dog-pocalypse, the gang discovers that Scooby has an epic destiny, greater than anyone imagined. Let me ask you something. Does anything about that scream ScoobyDoo to you? Let's see, they have the word mystery, ghost, and of course ScoobyDoo. Literally nothing about that description, or for that matter, this movie feels like a Scooby-Doo film. The real star of this movie isn't even Mystery Inc. It's this superhero voiced by Mark Wahlberg named Blue Falcon, who is based off a character who made a handful of appearances during the Hanna-Barbera run. And to be honest, there's a reason that character was only in a few episodes. Because Scooby-Doo isn't Justice League or Avengers. Scooby-Doo is essentially the Hardy Boys with hippies. They literally put this character in the film because some studio exec was like, you know what kids love? Superheroes. Let's put a superhero in this picture. But isn't this supposed to be like a mystery movie? Quiet, intern. Do I need you to read the plaque on the wall again? Always capitalize on whatever is popular, no matter what. That's right, son. I'm like 90% sure that's exactly how it went down. One thing I'll say about this movie is it's definitely the most 2020 movie you'll ever see. By that I mean it felt like I was breathing in nothing but stale polluted air for an entire 90-minute runtime. Exploiting a genre that peaked a year ago? Check. A fictional in-universe app for the mystery gang to use? Check. Celebrity cameos of people who were relevant a decade ago? Check. Fighting to stop the dog apocalypse? Check. This movie isn't even so good it's bad. I just feel like I wasted over an hour of my life. Scoob gets an F. The final film that I want to share with you is one that really took me off guard. Honey Boy. This movie is the semi-autobiographical tale of Shia LaBeouf, jumping from his life as a child star on the Disney Channel show Even Stevens, to his life as a troubled young adult in rehab. The thing that got my attention most about this movie is just how raw it is. Nothing about this movie feels fake. It all feels like Shia LaBeouf poured his heart out when making this film. The most prime example is Shia LaBeouf's performance as his own father. At first I wasn't sure if I'd believe his performance or just see Shia LaBeouf in a wig, but no, he 100% loses himself in this role, and he doesn't seem afraid to be honest with how he felt about his father. This man is the meanest individual alive, just constantly belittling his son, calling him names, manipulating him emotionally, offering him cigarettes, taking drugs around him, and even hitting him. And if this weren't autobiographical, you'd think this was faked or at least exaggerated, but because it's written by and about Shia, and because he disappears into this role so well, you buy it hook, line, and sinker. Literally, anytime Shia's dad appears on screen, I just got so nervous because all I could think was, oh man, what horrific and cruel thing is he gonna do this time? It's all done with a level of honesty and vulnerability that you just don't see in movies. The only real negative I have with this movie is while it is a fascinating character study into the look of Shia LaBeouf's psyche, it feels a bit rigid in its story structure. What I mean by that is it's very repetitive because it's the structure of Shia talking about his childhood trauma to a therapist, flashback to said trauma for the next 20 minutes or so, rinse and repeat. It's not necessarily a bad tool to use, but after a while of repeatedly using that method, you basically know exactly how the scene is going to play out from the dialogue alone. While this film's narrative structure could have had a lot more variety, it doesn't suffer too bad because the content within that structure is so emotionally visceral that you don't really seem to mind. If you're a fan of Shia LaBeouf and want to know more about how he became the person that he is today, I highly recommend checking this film out. And I'm going to give Honey Boy a B+. And that's all the movies and TV shows and video games and everything else I watched this month. Tune in next month for my review of Cool Cat Saves the Kids. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and you'll be the first to know about my videos. As always, I'm Higgs, this has been my flick, and thanks for listening.